everybody, in today's video we'll be looking at the Diva Pro. This is an arcade-accurate Project Diva controller, and it's compatible with the Nintendo Switch, PS4 and PC, which means you can use it to play Project Diva, Future Tone, Prelude, DX, Megamix and Megamix Plus. Also, as a side note, this controller was sent to me for free by Yubiparts, but I'm not being paid to make this review. Speaking of Yubiparts, they are a store located in the US that sells arcade parts. So if you also live in the US, it should be cheaper to get stuff from them compared to, well, importing stuff from Asia or Japan because of shipping. Do note that they don't carry arcade controllers themselves. So this means that if you're buying a controller through Yubiparts, the controllers are shipped from Asia, so expect high shipping fees. The Diva Pro was made in collaboration between Zhousensor and Genbu. I'm somewhat familiar with Zhousensor actually. I remember passively looking through their Twitter page and updates when they first made the first edition of the Diva Pro, and they were working on their Trinitum controller. The price for Diva Pro sits at $393.93 US. Funny Miku number. This is on the pricey side, of course, especially compared to other controllers for other arcade rhythm games. But honestly, this price point is kind of to be expected because I don't imagine there's a lot of people out there who want a Project Diva controller, and there's more parts when it comes to this, I think. And lastly, as for a massive warning, I'm not good at Project Diva. So this means that I don't know how to review this for gameplay. I don't know the ins and outs of the game and the pattern terminology that they use. Yeah, that kind of noob. So sadly, I won't be able to give you like a proper in-depth explanation of how this controller affects gameplay and how it compares gameplay-wise to a lot of other controllers out there. So I highly recommend that you watch Hisoki for a better gameplay-orientated review. My first impression of this thing was, holy shit, that's small! Don't get me wrong, if you don't own any arcade controllers, this thing is massive to you. But compared to every single thing I've ever owned before, this thing is tiny! It's way smaller than Diva, and it is the most compact controller I've ever gotten my hands on. For an idea of how compact it is, it's shorter than the Force 2. I mean, just look at it! How? But turns out the reason why it's so short is actually because it doesn't use the typical Omron switches that arcade cons usually use. On arcade controllers, the button plus the microswitch is what contributes to the tall height that controllers have. But since these don't even use Omron switches, there's no need to make the controller so tall. But if they're not using Omron switches, what are they using? Well, infrared sensors. Fascinating. And because these are IR sensors, you can adjust the button sensitivity on the controller? What? This is a completely unheard concept to me. Like, the only other game where I know you can adjust the button sensitivity is the taiko drum on the taiko cabinets in the arcade. The Diva Pro also only uses a single USB Type-C cable. Yep, only one cable to power the lights and the controller. It's not like a Type-B like everything else. The capacitive touch slider is very pretty. But note that I haven't touched a Project Diva cabinet since they disappeared from my country years ago, and I don't have my Diva with me right now, so I'm sorry, I can't really make any comparisons. The rainbow on it looks really good, though it's not as bright as the Diva, I believe. But honestly, I imagine there's a fair amount of people out there who aren't like me and don't enjoy looking at the digital equivalent of the sun. The touch slider feeling is also very smooth. A very smooth, frosted matte feeling. It's nice. The metal case is pretty basic. It kind of reminds me of Yuencon's metal cases on their controllers. It's definitely not CNC'd unlike the Diva. It looks like it's using something like sheet metal bending. So the controller is less premium in feel and in the looks. But looking less premium and feeling less premium is something that a lot of people would probably ignore in this case because this thing only weighs 3.5 kg. The Diva weighs over 9 kg. This is so much lighter. It's lighter than a Yuencon Sound Vortex controller. Think about that. I honestly just love how easy it is to store and move this thing. It's so light and so small. The buttons used are Baolian, Chinese buttons, and the springs used are Zhousensor's own springs. On default, it's installed with Zhousensor number 6 spring, which is Zhousensor's own measurement for spring weighting. The higher the number, the heavier it is. But from my extremely scuffed method of trying to measure them, the spring itself is over 400 grams actually. But since the springs aren't actually completely compressed when they're inside the buttons, they're more like 200-250 grams in actual play. And the other thing is, because the buttons only use a single spring unlike the Diva, the travel and whatnot feels a lot better than Gamo's 2's weird method of stacking 2 springs onto each other in the Diva, so that's a plus. There's extra touch buttons below the main buttons for navigation and settings adjustment. I actually found these really cool, but I personally would prefer actual buttons because they don't actually sense presses immediately when you press them. You have to hold them for a second before they're activated. I don't really like that because I just want to immediately use them when I do need them for the menus. But at the same time, I can see why that they're programmed this way. It's to avoid accidental triggers during gameplay, since these are like, touch sensor buttons. And here are the extra things that comes out of the controller when you get one. There are a lot of settings in this controller, like a lot. It's actually pretty overwhelming. I mean, well, it's not that overwhelming. It's just that the method of changing settings can take a bit of time to learn. So you see, since they don't have a software for configuration on PC or something, all of it is done on the controller itself. Entering the settings mode is easy. Just hold down all the buttons on the left. And then here, you can pick which settings to configure. To change the touch slider backlight, press L1. Here, you can change between a rainbow touch slider and a static color one by pressing any button. To change the touch slider color, press L2. This part is a bit different based on whether you're on the rainbow touch slider mode or the static one. Well, if you're on the rainbow one, you can use the touch slider to set the color range. But if you're on the static one, you'll see the color palette to adjust the colors on the touch slider. What is the color palette? Well, it looks kind of confusing, but it's actually not too bad. The 3 colors you see here are for selecting which RGB value you want to add. And the color on the far left is the resulting color you'll get from playing with the 3 values. For example, I want to set the color to cyan, so I'll select blue and set the brightness of it with the brightness slider here to the max. And then I'll select green and then set it to max as well. And then go to red and crank the brightness of red to nothing. You can play around with the slider and color values to get a color you want, but already having knowledge on RGB values will help a lot in understanding how to use this. You can also change the color of the touch slider when it's triggered by going into its menu with L3. You'll see the same color palette setting used for this one. And then to change the color of the buttons, press R3. Here, in the same menu, you can actually change the inactive and active colors. To change the inactive color of a button, just press the button you want to change and then release it. And then adjust the color of the color palette. To change the active color of that button, press and hold down the button while adjusting the color of the color palette. And that's basically it for the color settings. But here's the interesting setting that people will be touching. Changing the button sensitivity. You access it by pressing R2. Here, you'll see a couple of lines that will seem quite confusing to you at the start, but they are not. The white line is where the current depth of the button is. You can actually see how the button is analog by slowly pressing and releasing it, and man, that's so cool. The 2 yellow lines at each end actually represents the minimum and maximum possible button press depths. Don't note that the first yellow line is actually normally hidden behind the white line showing the current depth of the button. The blue line shows the depth at which the button will be activated, and the red line shows the depth at which the button will be released after getting activated. You can change the activation and release point of the buttons by holding it down on the line you want to adjust and sliding around. The closer you move it to the left, the higher up the actuation or release point will be, and the closer you move it to the right, the opposite happens and the deeper it'll be. The last settings is the other extras that the controller can do. To enter it, press R1. Here, you can set the game button colors back to default or set them to match an arcade machine. You can also change the USB mode here by tapping on this rectangle box of color. Red means it's on a special mode, green is for keyboard, and blue is for Nintendo Switch. The very last block of red is to reset the game button sensitivity back to the default. And that's it for the settings. To save them and exit from any settings mode, hold down all the 4 buttons on the far right. There's also other things like firmware upgrades and other notes in the manual. So I recommend you take a quick look through it if you ever get one of these controllers. It's a simple read and it's not too long. One extra feature this controller has compared to other Project Diva controllers on the market is the hold transfers function. Basically, on Project Diva, there are button holds that gives you more points the longer you hold them. Gamepad players actually have an advantage over arcade controller players because they're able to use macros with their gamepads to hold down certain button configurations longer for score. To remedy this, the Diva Pro has a hold transfer function. Basically, while you hold down the buttons on the controller but need to let go, you can touch any position on a touch slider and the controller will automatically press the up arrow on the D-pad. So if you have the up arrow in the game binded to a 4 hold, it'll hold down all 4 buttons while you can continue to press other buttons. I have no idea how well this works in-game, to be honest. I'm nowhere close to even being good enough to the point that I would use this feature, but I guess it's a pretty cool thing to add for people who want to use it. This is actually really fun to play on. Setting the button sensitivity to the highest makes the controller feel extremely responsive to play with. Like, jacks become a lot easier to do, which is great for a game like Project Diva that uses a lot of that in their higher level charts. It's definitely more sensitive than regular microswitch controllers, and it kind of makes me wish that I saw more of this in other arcade controllers as well, or straight up in arcade cabinets. The sensitivity of these, combined with the fact that it leads to such a compact controller, is so good. And not to mention, because these are like IR sensors, the buttons will last way longer than regular microswitches. But as per usual, because these are using gigantic buttons just like Pop-N, this controller is loud. Like, very loud. I definitely do not recommend this for people who have a household that cannot tolerate noise. Technically, there's a way to make this quieter. You could dampen the buttons with some fabric to quieten it up. Sadly, this has its limits and is still at the same level of loudness. but at least it's less piercing than before. Though at the very least, the IR sensors also help this controller with noise, because when it's at its highest sensitivity, you don't need to hit as hard anymore. But that also has a limit, because you will end up hitting with a moderate level of force on harder charts or when you're just trilling. So please take note of the sheer loudness of this thing if you're considering this. But in the end, if you're in the market for a Project Diva arcade controller, I personally think this is a better buy than Diva because of all the features it has. Hell, it's even cheaper as well. And because of the weight, shipping is also going to be a lot less painful. The only reason why you pick a Diva over this is if you really want something bigger and more premium in build. Though still, this is almost $400, to which at this price point, I really only recommend it if you're like absolutely dying for that arcade experience and you live in a household that's okay with the noise level on par with that one neighbor that won't stop wall drilling and hammering something at 8 in the morning kind of noise level. And also if you have the money for it. In the end, I'll leave it up to you guys to whether you're interested in such a controller, because after all, Project Diva is not a game that you strictly need an arcade controller for. I recommend you guys also watch Hisoki's review on this same controller and their reviews on other controllers for Project Diva. They're way more capable than I am in covering grounds related to gameplay. And so that's it for the Diva Pro review. If you guys are interested, I left a link to Yubiparts in the description, and thanks for watching.